It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast. We are, of course, presented by DraftKings. The crown is yours. By we, I mean me, Ross Tucker, the former NFL lineman turned broadcaster. You can check me out on social media at Ross Tucker NFL. And he, John Daigle from EstablishTheRun.com. Check him out like I do on social at NotJDaigle. Always use the code FEAST, by the way, to get the discount at the always excellent EstablishTheRun.com. Really, no matter what you're into, fantasy football, season-long, best ball, daily, NFL draft prop betting. I mean, we've had John on the Even Money Betting Podcast and might have to again this year to go over betting on the NFL draft. He's that good. That was actually where I first got the idea to bring him on here as my co-host on the Fantasy Feast, because he was so good on the Even Money Betting Show at NotJDaigle. We are at Ross Tucker Pod on all the social platforms. Really two reasons probably to follow that handle. Number one, you see the best clips of each show, the highlights of this show, Even Money, College Draft, Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Business of Sports, but also probably your first indicator as to the fact that the show is actually posted so that you can go and listen or watch youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. It's time for two of my favorite episodes of the year when we dive into the new faces in new places from a free agency standpoint. So today, it'll be quarterbacks and running backs. Now, of course, we hit on the big ones last week. If you missed it, go back and check it out. But we hit on Geno Smith and Fields and Darnold last week, as well as Najee Harris. But there's a bunch of other guys to dive into. Then next week, we will do wide receivers and tight ends. Then we're going to get into our draft series. Get you guys ready for the NFL draft on a lot of different levels, including our thoughts on the skill position prospects before they actually land with specific teams. Always helpful to know what we think of these guys as players before we know what their exact situations are. John, always good to talk with you, buddy. Always good to have you. We did hit on Geno Smith, Fields, Darnold last week. I guess I'll just give you one open-ended question. Any other thoughts now that it's a week later on what those landing spots are like for any of those guys or the skill position players on those teams? Maybe sweet music for Garrett Wilson in New York with Fields, his former college teammate?
Let's start with the Jets. As you mentioned, Justin Fields. And my concern for Garrett Wilson is that even George Pickens was not a top 24 wide receiver, where if you look at early best ball drafts on DraftKings, that's how Garrett Wilson is being treated, since the Jets really have no competition as their second receiver or tight end, since Tyler Conklin was gone in free agency. But the issue is that Justin Fields is exciting for fantasy, not for his arm, but for what he offered in his legs. And we talked about that in depth just last week, including that if you go back the last 3 seasons, basically every season he hasn't been coached by Matt Nagy, who did not understand how to use Justin Fields in his rookie year. He has recorded a top 12 start in 59% of his career starts the last 3 years because, again, of the 8.9 points per week he provides with his legs, not his arms, which is also why the inaccuracies downfield, why George Pickens struggled to be a top 24 wide receiver for fantasy. And given that is Garrett Wilson's current ADP, I am still concerned about the running back situation. I'm concerned about the wide receivers from Justin Fields. What I'm not concerned about, though, is Justin Fields in particular. That's my favorite way to exploit the Jets offense right now for fantasy. For the Seahawks, we do have a little more clarity this week, since we'll get into Cooper Kupp situation in depth on next week's episode. But it does look like under Clint Kubiak, who again, Sam Darnold didn't start with, but at least knows the playbook from 2023 with San Francisco when those two overlapped, we do now have a certain 2 wide receiver set between Jackson Smith and Jigba and Cooper Kupp. So we do have the 2 wide receivers that we believe Sam Darnold will be throwing to primarily, also as their 3rd wide receiver, and truly maybe even their only downfield threat right now, depending how they use Jackson Smith and Jigba. But Marquez Valdez-Scantling did show up to the Saints in the second half of the year under Clint Kubiak last year and was that team's deep threat. Boasted a 19-yard depth of target as the guy that Derek Carr or Spencer Rattler always looked downfield and just launched the ball to. So if they do go to 11 personnel, 3 wide receiver sets for everyone, that means that MVS is probably the guy who's running those deep routes as well over the top of Kupp and JSN. So that gives them a little more clarity, at least to who Darnold's going through. We did get some negative comments, always from fans, because they're very biased, about being concerned about Darnold and this offense, which were my comments last week. But again, we're playing this game from... That's exactly how we're looking at it, I should say. We are playing a game. Yes, we are doing football analysis and X's and O's. We both obviously understand those things. But in terms of playing the game, in order to be a top 12 quarterback, like Sam Darnold was last year, you still have to have rushing points. You have to be in great situations. And this, for Seattle, even in the best case scenario, is not, in my opinion, the same as Kevin O'Connell, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and playing indoors. It's entirely different. Also, we know from year to year in this dumb little fantasy game we play that touchdown rate for quarterbacks tends to regress annually. And so the fact that Sam Darnold is coming down from a career high 6.4% touchdown rate when his career average was 4.2% tells us most likely he cannot sustain that success that he did not have at all through the body of his career. So definitely worried about Darnold and the passing offense from the stance of a fantasy football lens. And then finally for the Steelers, it's funny because it's now been a week. We didn't even get to talk about DK Metcalf in depth last week because we just didn't know who would be throwing him the ball. And yet again, we don't know who's going to be throwing him the ball. Maybe it is Mason Rudolph, who, as it stands right now on their roster, would be the week 1 starter. I would imagine they maybe use that number 21 overall pick for a quarterback. NFL Network's Daniel Jeremiah in his most recent mock draft just had Jackson Dart going at number 21 overall. I'm not sure if that's rumors or just because he also looks at the roster and says there's no way this team can pay DK Metcalf $150 million and then think that Mason Rudolph is the guy who's going to help them get by on offense. So right now for the Steelers, it's just very confusing what the entire approach is under Tomlin.
So, boy, there's a lot there. It just occurred to me, by the way, John, that as we're recording this, first of all, the 3 quarterbacks that are most notable in free agency, Geno Smith, Justin Fields, Sam Darnold, all current or former New York Jets. And, when Rodgers eventually, we think, signs somewhere, there's a very real possibility this year that there are 3 New York Jets quarterbacks that are top 20 in the NFL, and the Jets don't have any of them. I mean, that's like a real possibility. Speaking of New York quarterbacks, as the Giants are still waiting on one, their former quarterback, Daniel Jones, he landed in Indy with the Colts. We didn't really break down Daniel Jones with the Colts last week. I can't remember when that happened. I don't recall, though, you and I really diving into it. So I'm curious, they're calling it open competition, John. So what does that mean from a fantasy value standpoint when it relates to Daniel Jones? Because I got to tell you, I know it's a competition, okay? Mm-hmm. But they're giving him $13 million guaranteed, I think.
Yep.
And I said this last week, and I'm actually going to write about it this week for the 33rd team. I'm bullish on Daniel Jones in the Colts offense. Here's what I'm envisioning. I'm envisioning Jalen Hurts circa 2022. I'm envisioning Daniel Jones is not good the longer he holds the ball in the pocket, but this will be the best receiving core he's ever had. This will be the best O-line, although the Colts have some work to do there that he's probably ever had. And I think Steichen will have him A lot of RPOs, getting the ball out quick, and utilize his legs. Is it crazy for me to be bullish on Daniel Jones and Steichen's offense?
I always like, just from my view, and I have no idea if this means anything for fantasy whenever a backup quarterback comes in, but I have always preferred that offenses sign guys where the playbook does not have to change from week to week. For instance, the opposite of this spectrum would be Lamar Jackson and Cooper Rush. For whatever we think about Cooper Rush as a serviceable backup, the playbook under Todd Monken has to change in Baltimore if Lamar Jackson goes down, because Cooper Rush cannot run that same offense. But keeping a guy, for instance, like Marcus Mariota, who signed for $10 million with Washington, as we saw last year in the times where Jaden Daniels goes down, you can still run those QB scrambles. You're not as efficient through the air, I understand that, but the playbook does not change under Cliff Kingsbury if Jaden Daniels is not under center. And that's what this situation reminds me of, because we have two quarterbacks in Indianapolis who are shaky from the pocket when everything breaks down. But more importantly, the offense does revolve around their legs. For fantasy, we even had to move down Anthony Richardson in our early rankings, and that's because, Ross, to your point, we do think Daniel Jones will make some starts. Honestly, what I think is going to happen is that whoever ends up being the week one starter has one of the shortest leashes in the entire NFL. In that you make one, at most two mistakes, suddenly you're yanked for the next guy, regardless of the preseason outcome, because you don't just give a free agent quarterback $13.1 million. It's not apples to apples, but for instance, Justin Fields got $30 million guaranteed to be the Jets starter. That's nearly half that Daniel Jones got to be a backup. And again, neither of us think he's going to be a backup for the entire year unless Anthony Richardson finally lives up to that high draft capital that he was initially drafted at by Chris Ballard. So again, it's going to be a finicky situation for fantasy, and it wouldn't shock me if either come out making a primary starts. If Daniel Jones were to win the job and play more starts than Anthony Richardson, for example, that would not shock me at all. For fantasy, though, it's obviously a very confusing situation.
That was an awesome weekend of basketball. I thoroughly enjoyed that while sipping on some delicious Smirnoff. You guys already know the mixtures I like to use. By the way, we got the Sweet 16 already coming up again this weekend, starting Thursday night. Smirnoff, not only an official sponsor of this show, the NFL Draft, it's the perfect vodka for crafting delicious cocktails, easy to make, versatile for any and all fans over 21. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff number 21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Please not share with anyone under legal drinking age. We are a month away from the NFL Draft. Smirnoff, my number one pick when it comes to vodka, because first of all, it tastes delicious. Secondly, it's inexpensive. It's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. Smirnoff. Speaking of confusing situation, Aaron Rodgers, still without a team here, more than a week into free agency. I guess there are some reports that he wants to go to the Vikings, but the Vikings aren't sure whether or not they want him. There's some thought that maybe he might retire. Certainly the Steelers and the Giants are both, as we're recording this, waiting on him. Where's the best fantasy landing spot? I mean, pretty clearly the Vikings, if he would go there. Do you think, John?
It has to be a situation with a good offensive line, since we saw last year that, at least while the Jets were still in contention for the playoffs, he was terrified of taking hits, which is why we talked about this last year as well on some of our matchup previews, that opposing defensive coordinators knew they didn't have to send extra pass rushers. Like, if you can get there with 4, Aaron Rodgers is guaranteed to dump the ball off and limit the explosiveness of their offense. And so it needs to be with a good line who can actually hold up in pass protection, and the Vikings showed just last year with Sam Darnold they can do that. So I think it would be a good one-year bridge for Aaron Rodgers. The issue also for anyone who brings him in, there are definitely questions about whether he would be the guy you even want to be the mentor or pass on tutelage to the younger developing person behind him, just because of who he has become in locker rooms, most recently tearing the Jets down from the top down. So I think we're in a situation where it's mid-March and no team outside of the Steelers and Giants reportedly have shown interest. I just think that's kind of where we are with Aaron Rodgers' career. It seems crazy, I know, that just 2 years ago, back-to-back MVPs, otherworldly plays, and then the last 2 full years he's played, his final season with Green Bay, and last year, a below-average quarterback. But that's what happens. These things happen in your careers overnight, unfortunately. And so I just think we're at a situation where Aaron Rodgers is best served as a backup, but locker rooms are definitely questioning, do they want to bring that kind of guy in?
Yeah, I think that's fair. What about Russell Wilson, John?
If we were talking about his situation in free agency after his first handful of starts with the Steelers last year, it would definitely be an entirely different conversation, and that includes going back to Pittsburgh. The issue is we're not, and we saw the last month of the season when the Steelers truly became one of the worst offenses in the league and then got to the playoffs and got motorboated in the first half of the year, just in the first half of that game, just run over entirely by the Ravens and knocked out of the playoffs altogether. And so I think a lot of teams saw that last month and a half from Russell Wilson, which was similar, unfortunately, to the Russell Wilson that was playing in Denver. And also we're questioning, do we want this guy on the team, since he's someone who I think he'd be a fine character to be a backup, just like Justin Fields, and Justin Fields supported him when he got into the starting lineup. But at the same time, again, would you rather spend that backup quarterback spot developing a younger guy, and is Russell Wilson efficient enough now to bridge you over until that younger guy's ready to step in? So it's a similar conversation with Aaron Rodgers, in that I think teams are also, again, questioning, like, what purpose does Russell Wilson have on this roster if we were to sign him?
Last week from the running back position, we touched on Najee Harris Najee Harris with the Chargers,
Yep,
and Javonte Williams with the Cowboys. The Cowboys have added another running back in Miles Sanders. Just curious what that does for you. He's very productive with the Eagles. Carolina just did not go well.
I honestly don't think they're done. That's where we're at, because both Javonte Williams and Miles Sanders, 1-year deals, and have definitely been extremely inefficient, as we've seen in the last year and a half that both have played. Miles Sanders, even last year, when they were trying to get him on the field around Chuba Hubbard, the Panthers, just instead gave Chuba Hubbard every carry possible. And so what I believe it says is that the Cowboys are definitely going to be interested in taking a running back at some point with one of their 3 picks in the first 2 days of the draft, rounds 1 through 3, or even, I believe I mentioned this last week, but in free agency, due to losing a lot of players, they picked up 4 compensatory picks at the end of the 5th round. So there's a lot of bullets here that the Cowboys have, even on day 3. And this is arguably, from everyone I've talked to, including someone I respect highly, late round quarterbacks J.J. Zacharyson in the fantasy space, this is one of the deepest running back classes and most talented that we've quite literally ever seen. And so even the day 3 guys who are extremely explosive and have a lot of receiving chops, which is how you get there in fantasy, even if the day 3 guys land in good homes like the Cowboys, there's depth charts here where they can leap up. And suddenly they matter most for fantasy in the fantasy playoffs when we want them the most on our roster. So I'm still very skeptical that either Javonte Williams or Miles Sanders will be the starting running back for this team in week 1.
It's a great point. I'm curious, am I crazy, John, or wasn't Rico Dowdle way better than both those guys last year, and yet the Cowboys didn't want to bring him back? He signs with Carolina to be the backup for Chuba Hubbard, but that would kind of reinforce what you're saying about the Cowboys perhaps drafting someone, because otherwise, why didn't they bring back Rico Dowdle? He was very productive for them and did some really good things.
And Dowdle's contract is similar to if you slapped Sanders and Javonte's together. 1 year, $6.25 million. Yes, there are some looming incentives that he could reach to make it a little more, but that's nothing, in my opinion, compared to what he gave the Cowboys over the second half of the season. In fantasy, over that last month and a half stretch, he was the RB18, so a serviceable starter for all of us as a top 24 player. And what it tells me also is that although Chuba Hubbard signed the extension in the last month of last season and had a very good year, we didn't get to see the Panthers much with Jonathan Brooks and what could have been a timeshare, but we did get at least 2.5 games. And in the second game, the only real quote-unquote full game that Jonathan Brooks overlapped with Chuba Hubbard, it was Dave Canales, Panthers head coach, who showed us that they did truly want to run a timeshare. In that game, if you recall, Jonathan Brooks actually out-targeted Chuba Hubbard 3-0 and out-touched him 5-1 in the red zone. Hubbard only out-touched him 12-9 in that contest. So what I think this deal tells us, especially for a player who showed he can be talented in a timeshare like Rico Dowdle, is that they want to alleviate some of the workload that Chuba Hubbard will receive, which makes me definitely concerned for Hubbard's outlook in fantasy, again, if you're doing early March drafts.
A lot of people scoring points this weekend in March Madness. You can score points at Labatt by getting gear for buying beer. Listen, the Labatt merch, I have a bunch of it. It's incredible. And you can get it just by snapping a photo of your receipt, uploading it instantly to rack up points for exclusive merch. Any store, any bar, stadium, doesn't matter. Buy beer, get gear. Go to rewards.labattusa.com to sign up. What about the Vikings? They brought back Aaron Jones, but that's not all they did. It was a Saturday night trade for Jordan Mason from the Niners and giving him $7 million fully guaranteed on a 2-year deal. What's your read on that one, John?
Last year, his first year under Kevin O'Connell, recall in the offseason, all the Vikings did, O'Connell included, was mention that they want to keep Aaron Jones healthy. That's the priority. And then what happened, I believe, along the season is that Aaron Jones was so good, so explosive, and they had no one else like Ty Chandler who they trusted with the ball that they had no choice but to ride Aaron Jones heavily. He finished as the RB20 in points per game with some massive ceiling performances, and that included a career-high 15 carries per week. I don't think they want to have that happen, though, again, with a player in his age 31 season who, again, has been often injured. Remember, with the Packers, whenever he ran for 100-plus yards and multiple touchdowns against the Cowboys in the playoffs, over his last 5 games with the Packers before he was released, he had 5 consecutive 100-yard games. They didn't release him for performance reasons. They released him because he was never healthy, and they could never trust him to be on the field to be that kind of guy. And so I think the Vikings were looking for another answer. And without many draft picks, the fact that they then went out and traded for a running back with one of their finite selections, I think tells us that they want to use Jordan Mason. And we saw Jordan Mason actually, remember, in the first 6 games he played for the 49ers. When he was fully healthy, he got injured with that, dealt with multiple shoulder injuries in the back half of the year. Plus then Isaac Guerrero came back and added a little bit of pop to the lineup. But in the first 6 games, when he was the 49ers starter, he led the league with 20 carries per week and 16 fantasy points. He showed he can be a workhorse back. Not a receiving back. He did not earn targets, but that's also where Aaron Jones shines. So I think it's going to be a strong committee still favoring Aaron Jones, 60-40 timeshare. But I do think Jordan Mason is going to be a key player in fantasy and someone you probably want to draft in the back half of your fantasy draft.
What about in Pittsburgh? They lost Najee Harris. He went to the Chargers. We talked about that last week. Is Kenny Gainwell someone that should be on our radar from a fantasy perspective?
I think the winner in signing Kenneth Gainwell is Jaylen Warren, because this is only a 1-year, $1.7 million contract for Kenneth Gainwell, who the Eagles also never trusted to be a full-time back. The one opportunity he had, he was usurped by DeAndre Swift very quickly. And DeAndre Swift instead was the running back who led that team in both touches and rushing yards until he went off and signed with Chicago in free agency. But for Kenneth Gainwell, he's a complimentary player. He does a couple things right, including being in on third down. And why it's good news for Jaylen Warren is that, to me, that tells me, since Najee Harris left, that Warren is the guy who would be leaned on in this scenario. Because remember, right now, the Steelers only have the number 21 in the first round and number 83 overall picks in the third round, since they did trade a second rounder for DK Metcalf. And this is an offense under Arthur Smith that was one of only 4 teams to run the ball on 60% of their plays last year. They are a run-first team, as Arthur Smith always showed us, in Atlanta as well. And the fact that they don't have a running back or the capital to draft a running back who we think can compete with Jaylen Warren, I think tells us early on that Jaylen Warren is instead the winner and the guy we should be drafting highly in fantasy.
I love Jaylen Warren. I'm excited to see
so
that.
explosive.
Yeah, the last thing is, anything notable about Kareem Hunt going back to Kansas City and maybe what that means for either him or Pacheco?
I think it's a good pickup for the Chiefs in that he was their goal line back. Pacheco obviously tried to come back, as we've seen so many times, from the leg injury. Was unable to be efficient at all when he returned in the playoffs. But Kareem Hunt did all the things that Andy Reid and coaches tend to like. Good at pass protection, solid hands, regardless of how explosive he is, and again was very good at bruising at the goal line. So just someone for the Chiefs to trust. A 1-year, $5 million deal. Nothing to write home about. The Chiefs can definitely add another player through the draft. But right now, at least early on, it does seem like it's once again going to be Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt, which is the same situation they were in last year. So there's just something for us to consider that maybe Kareem Hunt does once again open up in a timeshare and limit Pacheco for fantasy.
We are talking receivers and tight ends next week, and there's a lot of them to get into. We haven't discussed very many at either one of those positions, and we know how important they are for fantasy. Check him out at NotJDaigle. Never forget, establishtherun.com, but use the code FEAST. I am at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. Other than that, I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcasts on your favorite platform.